So in order to get the maximum damage output, I've gone around and extensively tested all 8 of the weapon sets. Some have gone under significant changes with the previous update. So here I'd like to share the data with you guys, and it may help you, no matter what weapon combo you're using, to give you that damage edge. It may not always be recommended to use the exact set the game suggests. So I've gone through many versions of testing to find out which will be the most reliable. And the latest has been to use a special attack here, a heavy attack, a martial attack, and then 60 hits of my umbrella with the spring away skill. And you can check exactly here how much damage we dealt across those 60 hits. We can then track this, input it on our sheet according to which weapon set we're using. You don't only gain this 4-piece bonus, but you also gain a 2-piece bonus. And this differs depending on the set. This can also affect the outcome. So in terms of the current Swift Gale set I'm using, the average damage score was just over 75,000. Now you will see this is our lowest result, as this is a PvP orientated set. And I don't recommend anyone use this when trying to min-max PvE damage. So next we look at the Swaying Heights set. You get min physical attack, and you increase your damage dealt against targets with 50% or more HP. That effect increasing the more HP the target has above that 50%. Against this dummy, technically the test is in favor of it. So the average we find for it is over 81,000 damage. Again, using the exact same test, resetting the dummy between each test. We'll look back later whether you should actually use this set when we compare versus others. So the Swallowcall set is another set where it's favored within this test because of the 12% to light attacks, which I believe should apply to my charge skill Spring Away, meaning all these hits get that 12% extra. So that will definitely be something to keep in mind when comparing this damage output. But it's already lower than the Swaying Heights set at just over 80,000. But then we have the Ivorybloom set. If you're at full health, you will have an extra 5% chance to critically hit and gain a 15% extra critical damage. This unfortunately doesn't appear to show on our stats sheet when we use it, but the average damage that we get across 20 tests of over 1,200 hits is 83,700 damage, higher than any of these we've looked at so far. But yes, it comes with the catch, you have to be at full health. So we'll then look at the Mistwillow set. This has been updated a bit, and it's the reason why we are using our fan special skill and then heavy attack skill to actually trigger it. That way we gain the 12% damage to light attacks and projectile skill damage. This is pretty much solely a set directed at the umbrella. All your umbrella attacks are considered projectile. So 80% of your damage on Silkbind Jade is going to get affected by this 12%. And in this test, it's reflected as an average damage output of nearly 83,000. But yes, interestingly a bit behind the Ivorybloom set. So then we look at the Rainwhisper set, simply going to be a 10% extra critical damage boost. We're not able to gain the 15% because we can't gain a shield through our abilities. And this resulted in an average of 78,000 damage. Looking then at the Hawkwing set, this can give you up to that 10% physical damage boost, 2% times 5. Very easy to maintain, at least on an umbrella here, where you output a lot of hits. And what we found was the average to be actually still under 80,000. And this is rather surprising. I assumed the output would be a bit better, but perhaps this may be due to the case that the output's getting diminished due to all the other physical attack bonuses we may have. So finally we look at the Jadeware set. This has been reworked, and on paper it has some serious burst damage potential. However, the average damage output was only 79,000. So we end up with this being all of our tests. Again, I've done 20 tests where that's 60 hits each, meaning a sample size of over 1,200 hits with these armor sets. I am not using any inner ways where you're going to have chance trigger effects. I'm not using moral chant because this builds up over time, and I'm not using Star Reacher because I can't maintain this bonus also for the full duration of the test. I am starting the rotation with Peak's Springless Silence because I want to trigger Lingering Bone on the target to then also be able to cast this Pursuit skill, which is considered a heavy attack necessary to trigger the Mistwillow set. Then to trigger the Jadeware set, I have to use a Martial skill, so that's why we use the Emerald Barrier. But then if we compile all this data in a chart to visually be able to see which is better and by how much, we find this when sorted from the best to the worst. The Ivorybloom set was over 10% better than Gale, which was effectively using no set. It's not giving us any damage bonus other than this extra max physical attack, which is very little compared to the amount we already have. This is then followed by the Mistwillow set, which makes sense. The entire set effect is designed solely around the umbrella and its projectile attacks. While you continually attack, you can maintain this bonus all the time. That's followed by Swaying Heights. However, I will say that this test, since we barely even scratched the HP of the dummy, is overly in favor of that set, and I'm quite frankly surprised that it didn't do better. But in actual practice, when you're in a real fight and you're getting the boss from 100% to 0%, the set half the time is going to basically have no effect. So I would reduce its effect by a half, putting this down to like 3 to 4% better than, say, Gale. And similarly, the Swallowcall set, which is a 12% damage boost to light attacks, this test is also biased towards it, because yes, we are just counting the damage from light attacks, where in a full fight, we can see our damage breakdown here, and Spring Away is only 32% of our damage. So this set, only affecting a third of our damage output, would perform significantly less in a real environment like this with all the extra damage bonuses. So I would also say, instead of it having a 6% lead, it would be more like a 2% lead. As for the Hawkwing set, I think this test was fairly fair on it. Yes, some weapon combos may have less damage boosts, and so it may not be as diminished as you find with the Umbrella and Fan, which stacks a ton of damage buffs. But yeah, Umbrella Fan, Hawkwing set just ain't that great, and only about a 5% boost above basically nothing. As for the Jadeware set, I am surprised it didn't do better, but I guess this can be dependent on how much affinity you have. If you're really low, then that extra damage boost to affinity damage is not going to do a whole lot, and that would be the main thing to carry this set. But it also does not have a full uptime, only lasting 8 out of 12 seconds, and you have to cast a martial skill to trigger it. May not be suited for all builds, but on Umbrella and Fan it makes sense. It's about 4% better than nothing. As for the Rainwhisper set, 10% boost to critical damage, makes sense that it doesn't do a whole lot more than 3% versus nothing. And that's because we already have 50% critical damage. Adding another 10% is only going to be diminished, and we're not always going to land critical hits. In my tests, I'm around the 60 to 70 mark. So we can sort this here, and this is the kind of chart we're getting. Particularly for Umbrella and Fan, you want to be using Ivorybloom or Mistwillow after that 1.2 update. So I better get these changed. And the question is, which out of those two? And this is very dependent on whether you're running with a good healer and if you can avoid taking damage. Yes, the potential for Ivorybloom is very high, as we see with these average damage values from the test. It was just doing nearly 1,000 damage better, over a 1% difference. But you have to be at full health. So for most people, I wouldn't say it's worth using. However, I personally will be using it. It is even a bit better again than the Mistwillow set, because something I actually didn't account for yet was what I mentioned earlier, is the Mistwillow set will not affect all your damage equally. After 2.7 million damage, this was my breakdown. And we can calculate how much of that is actually light attack and projectile damage. It's nearly 80%. So that leaves another 20% of our damage not affected by this set, which would reduce the overall effectiveness of this set by that bit more versus the Ivorybloom set. So you may end up seeing this set performing only just over 7% better. So in a lot of cases, Ivorybloom for min-max is best in slot. If we do look at the other paths, if you're not running Silkbind Jade, say Bellstrike Splendor, it suggests the Jadeware set. And this actually makes sense. You're running the Nameless Sword, you don't have a lot of attacks per second, you can't exactly take advantage of the Hawkwing set, unless you're running damage over time with your Dragon's Breath. So even though Jadeware set might be a little bit worse, I would stick with what the game recommends. But as we tested, Ivorybloom is going to be better, quite a bit better than Jadeware, by nearly 6%. But you have to be at full health. As for Bellstrike Umbra, the game suggests Hawkwing, and there's a very good reason. You have lots of little hits, you can easily trigger it, and it is a little bit better than Jadewire. But again, if you want to min-max that damage, you can be at full health. Ivorybloom is going to be better. As for the tank, this is recommended to run Rainwhisper set. And if you can maintain having shield all the time, this is a super good set. Way better than Ivorybloom, which is just going to be a 5% crit chance boost and 50% critical damage versus a 25% critical damage here while you have a shield. Additionally, your tank, you're probably going to end up being queued as a tank. The boss is going to focus you, and you don't really want to run a set where you're going to lose damage when you're not at full health. So yes, I would go with what the game recommends. We already covered Silkbind Jade, but as for Bamboocut, this suggests the Swallowcall set, and this is not exactly something I can personally test when I'm running Silkbind Jade. I may later on get this fully upgraded and do some tests on it, but this states you can gain 10% Bamboocut damage with targets below 40% chi. That is going to be 40% of the fight in most cases, so yes, that 10% is more like a 4%, again, in the overall scheme of things. But you do also gain that 12% to your light attacks and rodents, which is probably going to be around 80% of your damage, maybe a bit less. So the set could nearly be as good as the Ivorybloom set, if not slightly better. It's something that, again, needs to be tested by somebody who dedicates themselves to playing Bamboocut and has a more min-max build. I would be interested to see results between the two. And finally, as healer, the game suggests Ivorybloom, and this is perfect. You can keep yourself healed, and you gain a 5% critical healing and 15% critical healing effectiveness. So that about sums it up. My data for all these tests, just keep in mind of the parameters of the test and how many hits. A bigger sample size would always be better, as there's quite a bit of randomness between them. Again, each test is comprised of 60 hits, and the game averages it out by just totaling that damage. We could add another row here saying average hit, which would be the average damage divided by the amount of hits. You can see you hit for nearly 1,400 with Ivorybloom, 1,264 with Swift Gale. That's the kind of difference you're looking per hit. The sample size of over 1,200 is pretty decent, so I'm fairly confident with these results, which puts Ivorybloom quite a bit higher than everything else. The only classes I wouldn't run it with is tank and maybe Bamboocut. But of course it comes with the caveat, you have to be at full health. You need to have a good healer, and you need to be avoiding taking damage. So overall, I hope this was somewhat insightful. Thanks all for watching. We'll see you guys around.